You're listening to Swinburne's AI in Education podcast. This podcast is being recorded on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the lands in Hawthorn and Melbourne's east and outer east, where Swinburne's campuses are located. We acknowledge the First Peoples are the first teachers, pedagogically caring for country, kin and ancestors. Today I'm joined by Professor Sir Chris Husbands, a distinguished public servant, academic and university leader, knighted in 2018 for his services to education. For 8 years, he led Sheffield Hallam University, one of the UK's largest, most diverse universities, winning national awards for teaching, enterprise, social mobility and community engagement, whilst reshaping institutional strategy, organisation and performance. Before that, he led the Institute of Education at the University of London, a specialist research institution rated first in the world for 3 successive years. With over 20 years of board level and chair experience, he's led national initiatives in public policy, schools and higher education, and continues to advise governments and institutions internationally. He's now Director of Higher Futures, a consultancy supporting strategic change in higher education, and a visiting professor at King's College London. In this episode, we'll examine the profound impact of AI on both vocational and higher education, asking how universities can respond to the rapid technological change while ensuring equity and maintaining their social licence. As AI reshapes teaching, learning and workforce demands, dual sector universities face unique challenges and opportunities. Our discussion deep dives into the strategies for making AI-driven transformation inclusive for all students, not just the privileged few, and considers how universities can build trust and legitimacy with the wider public. Join us as we challenge assumptions, surface uncomfortable questions at times, and explore what it really means to teach, learn, and lead in the era of AI. Chris, thanks so much for joining me today. With AI shaking things up across both vocational and higher education, many of us are questioning where AI is taking us and reflecting on, as a sector, really if we're ready for what's already here. As you know, Swinburne's a dual sector university. Given your extensive experience both in vocational and higher ed in the UK, I'm interested in getting your perspective on how do you see the role of dual sector institutions evolving as AI accelerates change in both teaching and workforce demands?
Well, Rowena, thanks very much for inviting me to join you on this podcast. And it's been really interesting both to spend some time in Australia, working with several institutions, but particularly interesting to spend a day at Swinburne. I've learned a huge amount. I've met some incredibly interesting people and found lots of points of comparison between Australia and the UK and lots of points of difference. Just before we talk a little bit about dual sector institutions, it's probably worth saying that in the UK, for a whole range of reasons, we don't have the same tradition of dual sector institutions. We have one dual sector institution, but it's been created by the merger of what you'd call a TAFE and a university. And even then, it's in a group structure rather than an integrated TAFE structure. We've done an awful lot better, I think, on thinking about collaboration between TAFE and universities. And although we're going to think about dual sector institutions, it is just worth a few words on why that harmonisation is so difficult. And I think it plays into the story. Universities and TAFE institutions were often set up with different philosophies. They were set up for different reasons, and they have different funding and regulatory arrangements. And that means that if you want to be serious about harmonisation, and we do, if you want to be serious about harmonisation, and there's lots of interest in harmonisation right around the world, if you want to be serious about harmonisation, you have to work really hard to bring together diverse priorities, diverse cultures, as well as different funding and regulatory arrangements. And what that tells me is that as we look to the future, we're going to demand really imaginative leadership from people across TAFE and higher education, and therefore across dual sector institutions.
before you jump in, I'm just thinking about our listeners, and you mentioned, and I've heard this quite a bit lately, is this harmonisation. What exactly do you mean about, that harmonisation across the sector?
Well, again, I'm going to sort of bounce that back and say, what do you mean by what do you mean? So then I think we'll start it in a slightly different way. Look, in advanced economies, over the last generation, we have seen remarkable increases in young people's participation in higher education. We've moved from a system in which sort of 8, 10, 12, 15% of young people moved into university to a system in which over 40% of young people work into university. And that's been a great success. But as we've got to that level of over 40%, we've started to think much more systematically about what are the prospects, what are the pathways, what are the outcomes for young people who do not progress to higher education. And so this interest in how the whole tertiary system harmonises, coheres, interrelates is a head-scratching policy challenge right the way around the world, from Manchester to Melbourne, from Bristol to Brisbane. And that's so the question of what harmonisation looks like is non-straightforward. What I think we mean is that the different institutional parts of the system should be geared to collaborate and cohere. That's the sort of the supply point. The demand point is that the choices that are open to young people about the routes that they take should be as straightforward and simple to operationalize as possible. It should not close down possibilities if you choose to begin your post-18 career at a TAFE institution rather than university. It should not close down possibilities if you start at university rather than a TAFE institution. So harmonisation, which is the word you quite rightly challenged me on, is about how you get the system to work more effectively. And it's not straightforward. And everybody, or not quite everybody, but lots of governments are exploring that. The reason I think it sort of ties up to your question about AI is that we simply don't know yet the full extent of the impact of AI on institutions, on jobs, on the workplace. I say the full extent. We are in a different world. We're in a world in which generative artificial intelligence, in which machine learning play an increasingly significant part in workplaces of all sorts. The workplaces that we're sending our students to, and universities and TAFE institutions as workplaces. What we do know is that a vast number of the jobs that we have trained people to do will either be eliminated or more likely changed as artificial intelligence embeds and accelerates. And that will happen at the highest levels of the skill hierarchy. It will happen at mid-levels of the skill hierarchy. It probably, slightly ironically, may not happen at the lowest levels of the skill hierarchy. There are lots of relatively unskilled manual jobs are actually going to be quite resistant to digital transformation. But for all the jobs at the middle and higher levels, there's going to be a profound demand. And that means that there's a collective challenge to think about how do we respond to this? What are the ways in which distinctively human and distinctively interpersonal skills and knowledge and practices play in? And that's not something that's just a challenge for TAFE. It's not just a challenge for higher education. It is a challenge right across the skill hierarchy.
Thank you, Chris. And I can see that, as industry continues to evolve at such a rapid rate due to technological advancement,
it's not just about a finite shift, is it? It's about that continuous learning over a whole lifetime. And I can see that relationship of, that the harmonisation of the sector, because even once you have your degree, that's not the finite point. That learning needs to continue to happen. And how do we as a sector sort of offer that place of learning through continuous shifts, not just what we're experiencing now?
No, and I think the general proposition, the general experience of technological change is that it places a premium on higher level skills, that you get a sort of ratcheting effect, that more technology demands higher skills, which generate more technology, which demand higher level skills. So that wherever your qualifications journey takes you by the age of 16 or 18 or 21, there will be a need to upskill, to develop at 25, 28, 30, 35, and so on and so on. The learning, which used to be something that we front-loaded careers with, you did your learning and then you got a job, then you retired. Learning moves from the front end of adult life to something that's absolutely embedded inside it. And if we don't get that right, then we will not be equipping people to respond to the challenges that they're going to face.
Thank you. I'm thinking now about what we're talking about in terms of this continuous change that we're experiencing, what this means for our educators, and how they're grappling with developing curriculum and programs that are best fit for the needs of industry that continue to change. In your view, what are the most profound ways that AI is currently impacting learning and teaching in both vocational and higher education?
So I used to be a Vice-Chancellor. I spent 35 years working in universities. And whether I've been a lecturer, a head of department, a Pro-Vice-Chancellor or a Vice-Chancellor, I've always been absolutely passionate about the teaching and learning mission of the institutions that I've run. So I just think teaching is a really exciting thing to think about and talk about. And I'm continually now, in the work I do with universities, coming across, your question was about profound ways. I've come across the most imaginative ways in which people are engaging with AI, and I struggle to keep up. There's no leading edge. There's sort of leading edges in every direction. So there's a couple of general observations I'll make on this. The first thing is that it was incredibly striking how the instinct of virtually every university in the world when ChatGPT arrived was not to think about teaching and learning, but to think about assessment, to think about this as an academic integrity challenge. And in one sense, I get that because it is an academic integrity challenge. But I thought it was quite interesting that the collective instinct of the world's universities was to think about constraint rather than opportunity. So that's I just observe that. I think that we're a little bit beyond that now. I think that I'm not saying that we've solved academic integrity. I think that academic integrity is something that institutions have had to work at for time immemorial. And the problem of academic integrity did not begin when generative AI arrived. So let's not pretend it's a new problem. It's not gone away. But I think increasingly we're thinking about opportunity. The second observation I'd make is that in many cases students are ahead of staff. That they are finding ways to explore and experiment, and in one sense that's great. We'll come on to questions of equity, I think, a little bit later, but it does mean there's a challenge for staff to keep up. The third thing is that, which is connected to that, is that given that students are going to experiment and given that students are going to explore, it's absolutely fundamental that we embed ethical and sustainable thinking about generative artificial intelligence. That feels really important. This is a morally serious activity. It's an ethically challenging activity in lots of respects, and it raises enormous questions of sustainability. And we've got to bring our students with us on that journey. The final bit of the question is that. Given the vast amounts of really interesting experimentation with the development of courseware, the development of course materials, the development of learning platforms, the development of authentic assessment, and so on, the most important thing that we have to do as universities is to develop the capability of our colleagues to develop their skills alongside the use of AI. I'm an old man, and I can understand why some academics who might find this a really profound challenge, and we owe it to everybody to take them with us on the journey.
And potentially sees as an opportunity to solve some of the perennial challenges that we have faced around resourcing time.
Absolutely. Yes.
I think, when we're talking about opportunities, we often, I think about student learning first, which is actually how it should be. That's our role as educators. But also, what are the productivity gains or the way in which we can use AI to actually help educators too?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think if we are going to think in terms of productivity gains, I think there's a really tough challenge for everybody in how we realise those productivity gains. Technology can be, and this is a general point about technology, it can be a time saver. We also know it can be a dreadful time waster. So there's a bit of focus required.
Yeah, and I think it's very early to see, the research still isn't really clear exactly what the productivity gains are. No. We're not really seeing that yet.
No, we're not.
We've got, universities, organisations globally having to invest in platforms, tools, without yet really knowing what the return on investment will be.
The economics of this look curious, don't they?
They do. We're talking about productivity gains and the potential and the opportunity, but that won't be realised for all students and everyone, within a university. And I'm wondering what your thinking is around, the fact that some of our students are facing increased financial hardship. Some of them are taking their assessments on their mobile phones. AI does potentially serve a risk in exacerbating a digital divide and inequality. What are your thoughts on, how we might be able to overcome some of those potential risks and inequalities?
Overcome is a strong word, and I think this is a really challenging question. Let's be honest about that. I don't think there's not a straightforward answer. The economics of the world we're in are profoundly challenging. The material circumstances that lots of our students find themselves in is really, really tough. And the direct costs of AI tools can be high. And so there's a really significant equity challenge. I'm going to just answer this first in what I think is not an entirely satisfactory way, but I think it's an important part of thinking. So the problems of equity and access to resources, again, didn't start with the development of generative AI. It has always been the case that some students, by virtue of their material circumstances, by virtue of the resources they have at their disposal, are more advantaged than others in their access to resources. Now, the point about saying that this is not a new problem is that once you say it's not a new problem, you start to realise that we've put in place in the past measures that enable us not to overcome, but to mitigate those challenges. So we can do the same again. And I think thinking about this in terms not of the challenge of AI, but the challenge of inclusion and equity is the right lens to do this. And we know we've got some very highly developed tools and some incredibly committed people who are able to think incredibly imaginatively to understand the circumstances in which different students find themselves, to think about what resources can be made available. And as I say, given the world we're in, you can never equalise, but you can mitigate. So let's think about this not as a new problem, but what's the learning that we've got from old problems that enable us to solve it. So that's my part of my answer. I know it's not an entirely satisfactory answer, but most of the problems that we face here are versions of problems that we've faced before. I think linked into that, there's a deeper question about how we engage and prep students for the range of activities that we want them to do. The last institution I ran was a university of great diversity. And we worked really hard to ensure that students had access to the resources that they needed in order to position themselves to access the learning that we required of them. Do you fix all the problems? No, you don't. Can you make progress? Yes, you can.
Yeah. And how much is that, do you think, in the importance for universities to really get clear on what their purpose is? What is their value that they're offering their students? And if AI is part of that picture, is resourcing those tools for students?
Yeah, look, most of the very complicated questions on strategic implementation do come down to some very simple questions, and absolutely understanding what is your value proposition as a university? What is it that you are trying to achieve? And what are the tools you're able to bring to bear to achieve those goals? Those are some absolutely core questions. We don't solve all the problems. We can't fix all the problems. We can't boil the ocean, but what we can do is to say, given the task on which we are engaged, these are our core priorities. Let's focus on those.
So, as you mentioned, there's not enough resources to solve all the problems. So, getting clear about what the priorities are, what universities' purpose and the value they have to offer. Looking ahead, what do you see the major drivers over the next period?
One of the things I've learned over a very long career is that predicting the future is a mug's game. You get things wrong a lot of the time. So I'm going to ask that question slightly differently, which is to think about the way you think led me at the end on what are the big change drivers. Education. So participation in higher education around the world has increased just remarkably over the course of my lifetime. In the last 55 years, we've seen a 7-fold increase in higher education enrolments around the world over a period in which world population has essentially doubled. So we've really significantly seen upticks in participation right across the developed economies of the world. We now see participation rates of north of 40%, and we're seeing massive upturns in participation in South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. By 2040, I appreciate it sounds like a prediction, it's actually a trend. A majority of the world's students will be in developing countries. So the first change driver is that education remains really significantly important, and higher education remains important, and that's really important. That this remains a really core part of the 21st century economy. Alongside that, if you look historically, what are the big drivers in change? Demography is always a driver. So population trends, migration trends is a major driver. Technology is a major driver. Investment flows are a major driver of change. So that tells us that higher education continues to be important, that demand remains buoyant, and you've had the Accord in the last couple of years in Australia that looks towards extending higher education participation by widening access. Now, again, you can put a ... on the end of that. If you're going to raise participation by widening access, you're going to further diversify student populations. So there's another trend, further diversification in student populations. Wherever technology is now, it's not going to be there in 5 years' time. It's not going to be there in 10 years' time. And we're going to have to work really hard as institutions. No institution anywhere no university institution anywhere in the world has pockets deep enough to make all the technology investments it would ideally like to make. So there's choices involved. So we now start to plan out a future which looks like continued high demand, further diversification, further technology change, really significant choices that need to be made to connect those things up.
Thank you, Chris. Finally, in Australia, discussions, debates, not just in academia, but in the media, beyond, with universities' social licence. In your view, how can we continue to maintain our legitimacy and our value to the public?
This is a really interesting and challenging question. And of course, you've talked about Australia. We see lots of things playing out in the United States, playing out slightly differently in the UK, but some of the same issues there. There are all sorts of curious features of this. As it happens, we're recording this on a Friday afternoon near the beginning of November. A couple of days ago, we had a bit of survey data come out in the UK, which asked people whether they had a positive or negative image of universities. And 66% of respondents had a positive image of universities, which is great. 34% therefore didn't, but we'll take the 66%. When we did some work on this a few years ago for the Civic University Commission in Sheffield, we found that the more people understood about universities, the more positive their view was. And the less they understood about universities, the more concerned and suspicious they were. The more engagement people had with universities, the more they understood the value of universities. Those people who'd been to university just didn't need convincing of the value of it at all. Those people who had not been to university or who didn't have children at university needed the most convincing. So I think once you put it like that, you end up with this as an information challenge. This is about getting out there and telling our story. And we can be quite good at that. My criticism of I mean universities, is that we are really good at talking to people who are already listening to us. And we've got to find ways of talking to people who aren't listening to us. So it's get the story out and get the story out into communities who are not listening to us. I'm going to end this with a sort of a data point, and it is a really, really important data point. So in the year 2000, we began a very big longitudinal study in the UK, tracking the lives of 27,000 children born in the year 2000. And that work continues. It's a mix of some biomedical work, but there's lots of survey work. In 2003, the mothers of the Millennium Cohort study were asked what they wanted for their children's future. And they were asked whether they wanted their children to go to university. And I sort of run this data in lots of seminars and conferences, and I always say, what proportion of respondents, what proportion of mothers said they wanted their children to go to university? Do you want to have a guess? Do you want to go?
I would have thought, upwards of 80%.
Yeah, it's 97%. It's 97%. Right, and that's really, this remains, university remains something that is aspirational, that people see the value of. Think of all the politicians in the world, what they would kill for an approval rating of 97%. So it's really important. So we've got these are great institutions. They do great work. We are great institutions. We do great work. We need to get out and tell the story.
I think that's a perfect place to finish. Thank you so much for your time today, Chris.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.